government.
All right, let's get into our final discussion now. Private primary and secondary schools are often touted to be better than public primary and secondary schools in terms of facilities, quality of teaching, among others. But the Rwandan example has proved that this is not always the case.
Yes, indeed. Now, running a private school in Rwanda is now bad business, as public schools are running their private counterparts aground, as pupils are abandoning them to enroll in government-owned schools. Reports say at least 30 private schools have closed indefinitely this year, while others are struggling to meet up with financial obligations as a result of the mass exodus of students to public schools.
So what was the strategy? That's a big question every African would like to know. Now, the Rwandan government embarked on a huge investment in capacity and teaching infrastructure, introduced about 12-year basic education policy, that's a long term, making public schools free, as well as the introduction of the school feeding program. What lesson can Nigeria learn from this? What lesson can other African countries learn from this? These are the big questions this morning. And we have joining us on Skype from Kenya, a public affairs analyst, David Zaremka. David, good morning. It's good to have you join us now.
Good morning. Thank you.
Thank you. You have been following developments in the education developments in Rwanda. When we got the reports that private schools are finding it difficult to survive in Rwanda, we were all really surprised. From your analysis and observation, what was really behind this?
Well, about six, 7 years ago, Rwanda moved from French to English. And when they did that, they did it overnight. At the end of one year, they were in French. The next year, they were in English. Many of the teachers were unable to really teach in English. And so many Rwandans that had some money would send their children to Uganda to boarding schools to get taught in proper English. And another reaction was to people to start private schools where they would get much better teachers. Frequently, they would bring them from Uganda or Kenya to teach good English. And so a lot of private schools developed and did quite well when they first started. But then as the system, I mean, there was a lot of work to teach teachers proper English and in-service trainings and all those kind of things, so that the Rwandan system has improved over the years. And as it has improved, the private schools are losing students. And it's to do a school, you have to have a certain number of students come. And if your enrollment starts declining, it makes it difficult for the school to continue. And so that's why, like you just said, 30 private schools have closed this year, because, of course, people now find that the government schools are up to snuff and they're teaching English decently and the other subjects, of course. And so they don't want to spend the money to send their children to private schools, and therefore they're behind the 8 ball at the moment. And I think only the best of them were going to survive, and they will be fairly expensive. So it's only the elite people who will be able to send their students to these good private schools. But most of them are going to go by the wayside.
Yes, and of course, it is a success story now for Rwanda, a country that has gone through all kinds of crises. Some have actually described the nation as a post-crisis nation. What is it about Rwanda that it seems to be getting it right on all fronts, not just in the area of education, environment, and in every area? Rwanda is becoming really the pride of Africa. Now, we hear that the country actually has invested hugely in public education, provided, school feeding and, of course, free education. In Nigeria, we have done the same thing practically. And we don't hear that private schools are closing down in Nigeria, in preference for public schools.
Even in Kenya, where he is.
Absolutely. So what are we doing wrong, and what is Rwanda doing right?
Well, what's happening here in Kenya, and I presume in Nigeria, is the public schools are being run down. There's way too many students. There's a tremendous shortage of teachers and classrooms and materials. So the private schools can compete, and people who have some income are willing to send their kids to much better schools. But Rwanda has, well, their strategy is that they want to turn themselves into a middle-income community that's educated. So they're putting a lot of resources into their education, particularly into their IT kind of things, that mathematics and science and those kind of issues. And this is their idea of how they're going to be. They're a small country in the middle of Africa, and so they have to do something different than other countries do. And Rwandans are very organized. They've always been very organized. And so when they decide this is the goal that they're going to do, they not only look at the goal, but they look at all the steps that are needed to implement that goal. And so they're working very hard to get a very good educational system that's useful in this modern era. And so that's why the education is improving there in Rwanda. Now, here in Kenya, for example, they're doing a reform here in Kenya, and maybe it will improve. But up to this time, the education in Kenya has declined considerably since independence.
All right, David, let me ask this. I remember in Nigeria, a few years after independence, there were efforts from a region to establish, or in fact it did, went ahead with free education. In many other African countries, after independence, there were issues of free education here and there. But in the 21st century, do you see free education really as a good, is it a win-win for government and the people to have free education because you want mass literacy?
Oh, yes, I definitely think you want to have free education. Unfortunately, what we call free education isn't always that free. I mean, you still have to buy uniforms, you still have to buy books and notebooks and things like that. And frequently the schools, at least here in Kenya, put on assessments for classroom buildings. For one I dislike very much is T for the teachers. So there are still costs. It's not free in the sense it is in some other countries where there are actually no cost whatsoever for going to school. But if you don't have that, what that means is only the people who have a certain amount of money are the people who are going to send their children to school. When they changed here in Kenya, 1 million students showed up the next year. Now, unfortunately, the Kenyan school system did not hire more teachers, build more classrooms, or anything like that. They just stuff the extra million students into the system. And so you need to have, I mean, in these days, you need to have a quality education if you want to move forward. And Rwanda is trying to do that. And maybe Kenya's now working on moving forward, but it's to be seen here. But I think Nigeria would be the same thing. If you want to have you can't have sort of a ignorant, uneducated workforce anymore. Even the simplest things now are being done with computers and things of that sort. So you need to have a good education, and it needs to include everybody.
Now, what will this policy, what will this move by the Rwandan government? Okay, sorry. We lost audio there.
All right, David, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. Now, I was going to ask, what impact this policy by government would have on competition. If you have private schools out of the education system, isn't there a tendency to, just focus on public schools, and then, the government can actually take things for granted where you don't have competition? Of course, the proprietors of these private schools are actually asking government to sponsor students and, provide the same rates as the public schools. How do you think this will play out down the line?
Well, the school system has to produce, and I mean, that's the real problems. And even in Rwanda, I've heard that teachers don't always come to class, and they don't come prepared and things of that sort. So you have to have a certain discipline in order to make your education work forward. I'm not sure I'm actually answering your question, but I think this is important to show you have to have quality in your teachers and your administration and how you're doing things. If you don't have that, I mean, it's kind of lax here in Kenya, and Rwanda has been able to not be relaxed and produce, and that's why they hope they can move forward.
All right, David Zaremka, analyst joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you very much for lending a voice on this. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, very interesting one.
Yeah,
we look forward to seeing private schools actually folding up in Nigeria.
No, but the last question you asked, when you're saying, is it really good for the society, for everyone to just switch over to public schools? You know, it doesn't make, it may not, because I was reading up, and some analysts were saying, no, it's not good for a robust education system to have just public schools alone or to have just private schools alone.
No
that mix is always good where you have choices to make.
Absolutely.
And it's the same thing with having different choices of food to eat or the different choices of TV stations to watch or radio stations, as a case. It makes it more robust.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's okay.
Let's
Well,
hope it works for them.
Well, this is where we come to the end of today's edition of the program. Thank you for spending your morning with us. I am Mike Okwache.
And I'm Ngozi Alibu. We hope to see you again tomorrow, Friday. It's a public holiday. Just stay with us here. But we won't leave without giving you weather outlook for major cities around Nigeria. Have a blessed day.